Welcome everyone to this latest edition of Two Heads Are Better Than One with me, Rod Grant.
And me, Cameron Wyllie.
And we're going to do some kind of funny anecdotes this time around, Cameron.
We're going to do some anecdotes that we hope are funny.
Well, indeed.
That's going to be the thing. Whether we can hear people laughing as they are listening to our podcast. Several thousand people have now listened to us, which is a constant source of mystery to me, I have to say.
Yeah. Well, we're not obviously be able to hear them laughing, but it would be nice if we got the occasional comment, you know.
Yeah, yes, we'd like more comments. We would definitely like more comments. We're very grateful to everybody who has responded to our plea for funny stories, which have come from all over. I should apologise in advance for the fact that I may sound slightly croaky at the moment. I'm thinking that my voice is broken now that I'm 68, and that's been very, very long awaited. So I'm hoping for this podcast only to sound almost as butch as Rod does.
Thank you, Cameron. Right, so we're going to start I don't know what else to say there. We're going to start with a story from Heather, who was an English drama teacher in Australia.
In Perth, Australia.
Perth, Australia. And she had a class of 18 male and 4 female students, and they were doing a course in first aid with the help of a fairly conservative Mrs. Baxter, not her real name, I don't believe. And this is the story. Mrs. Baxter led the first aid lessons while I ably assisted in such scenarios as the patient who had wounds bandaged, jellyfish stings attended to, and a limb immobilised after a snake bite. It was Australia after all. And as a drama teacher, I did tend to overplay my character hand, but I want it to be on the record that my rendering of a victim of a suspected electrocution was particularly noteworthy. Mrs. Baxter did pepper her feedback to me by occasionally mentioning phrases such as "enough class clowns already," playing to the audience, and most hurtfully, hamming it up. The final assessment was conducted by 2 assessors from the relevant authority, who were to audit student knowledge in the form of a class question and answer session. The evaluation went smoothly, and it was in the final minutes that one of the assessors asked a general question to the class of what was their favourite demonstration. Gemma's hand shot up and was chosen to stand and face the class to share her most memorable moment in the course. She told the audience that the best lesson was when Mrs. Baxter and Ms. Thompson demonstrated to everyone the missionary position. Students around her swung swiftly into damage control by shouting a correction, "Recovery position! Recovery position!" I was laughing so much that I had to stuff one end of my wool scarf into my mouth and run out of the classroom.
It is interesting though, Rod, how many of these stories have some sexual connotations attached to them. I mean, I was an English teacher, of course, and it was generally assumed and very often said by English students that English teachers were obsessed by sex because of, finding sexual imagery in Henry James' pointed cane and other things, I could go on and on and on about the scene with the pig in Lord of the Flies. No. I mean, that's just all sex, really.
Hey, please don't.
But, it does crop up quite a lot. I mean, the very, very first thing that I thought about when I was thinking about funny things that happened to me in the classroom was something that happened very early on in my first year of teaching, when I was teaching the 3rd year all boys, The Merchant of Venice, and I asked them to write a 3-sentence character sketch of Shylock, and one of them said, "I think of Shylock as a small fat man with a Dutch cap on his head," and it was really interesting because I didn't know whether to sort of say, "You mean a skull cap?" Or just, but I was really interested in where this 14-year-old boy had got the words Dutch cap from, but that was it. And I mean, obviously, lots of people can talk about schoolboy howlers, but on the note of that story from Heather, there's another story from Dorothy, who was a female teacher in an all-boys school, and I actually was at school as a pupil when Dorothy was teaching there, and there were 2 female members of staff in this school with 1,000 pupils. One of whom was a slightly stern older lady, and then there was Dorothy, who I think was about 24 and was gorgeous. And I'm sure that she was regarded as a very lovely thing to think about by lots and lots and lots of these adolescent boys. But she tells a funny story about sharing a slide projector with a man called George Strang, and he was in one classroom and she was in the other, separated by a wall. And because he was a gentleman, he gave Dorothy the slide projector first. She finished the bit of the lesson that involved the slide projector, and then she went next door, opened the door on George and his class of 16-year-old boys and said, "Mr. Strang, do you want it now or shall we wait till later?" And, you know, that's just innuendo. I mean, it's just innuendo, but I expect that Mr. Strang played up to that pretty fast as well.
Well, I was asking my wife actually last night, tell me some funny stories or anecdotes from your teaching career. And it was actually my son's class, primary 5 class. And she said, "Right, boys and girls, tomorrow we're going to do this year's standardized test." And it didn't really explain much more than that. And one of the boys came up at the beginning of break and said, "Mrs. Grant, I won't need to do that standardized test because I've just been to the optician and my dad says I've got 20/20 vision."
Brilliant. Primary school. I mean, Alison Hawkins, who, as many of our listeners, not the ones in Australia probably, but many of our listeners will know, runs a very, very good nursery. Just a wee advert here for Alison's nursery at Westercote. She tells a very funny story about going into a class of 7-year-olds at one point, and one of the boys was playing up, and his name was Neil. So she sort of shouted, "Neil!" and everybody in the class knelt down. That's the kind of teacher we require more of in Scotland. You say something to them and they do it these days. No questioning, no discussion of pupils' rights. There they were, all kneeling at her feet.
Absolutely. Lovely. And of course, primary classrooms are just perfect for that because the misunderstandings in that class as well, it was a kindness day that she would do.
Kindness is very important, Rod.
It is very important, and not enough of it just now.
There's not enough kindness in the world. Here we are.
We need a bit more.
We need a bit more kindness.
So Mrs. Grant was doing her thing about ensuring that children were being kind to each other.
Yeah.
And she said, "Right, we're going to go around the class." And she did this every Friday. She would pick one child and everybody would say something kind about that person.
That sounds like a slightly dangerous teaching technique.
So, and people were right into it. They understood it, and it plays beautifully, and you're very good at the violin, and she's a wonderful artist, and she's
great hair,
and she holds doors open for people, and she's always smiling, and she's always anyway. It came to this boy and said, "So, and what would you like to say about her?" And she said, "I think she's feeble." And she said, I won't say the boy's name, but she said, "What do you think feeble means?" "Well, gentle."
Oh,
so he was trying to be nice.
He was trying to be nice.
But again, 9 years old, just didn't quite have the vocab right.
Well, the misunderstanding of words. 2 stories, actually, from Stuart. Many of our listeners will immediately recognise the gentleman of whom I speak, but let's just go no further than to say he now resides somewhere distant in the borders. Anyway, he tells 2 stories, one of which is about saying to a kid at the end of a rugby match, "You were like an exocet today," and getting a letter of complaint from the boy's mother saying he really resented being called an exorcist. But even better is his story about when Stuart used to teach in Bermuda, and for reasons I have never fully understood, he then returned to Scotland to teach, which, having just spent a fortnight in Thailand and then having to come back, seems a very odd thing to do to me. I think, a really lovely life he must have had in Bermuda. But anyway, while he was in Bermuda as the head in Bermuda, he employed a teacher from Northern Ireland who had a very, very strong Irish accent. And anyway, she had her class and she sat them down on the first day, and then she got a letter from a boy in this class, a letter of a parent of a boy in this class, complaining about language, what she had called him, and she didn't understand what it was. And then, so she phoned the parent and she said, "What was it?" And the parent said, "Well, you called him a turd." And she said, "I didn't call him a turd at all." She said, and then she thought back, and then she remembered where the boy was sitting, and she said, "You just sit in the third row." And so he ended up he ended up believing she had called him a turd. That can happen quite a lot. I remember a very funny story where a lady called a member of staff an arse when she was angry with him, okay? And from a distance. So she shouted it. She shouted it from a distance. And said, "Stop being such an arse." She'd shouted at this member of staff. Now, the member of staff, now a headmaster in this country, had taken this very personally. I mean, when I was listening to him talking about it, I thought he was maybe taking it a wee bit personally because she was an angry woman.
Yeah.
So I phoned her up and I said, "Look, Mr. So-and-so doesn't like the fact that you called him an arse." And she said, "Mr. Wyllie, I would never dream of saying a thing like that to a teacher, as if I would say a thing like that." And she said, "What I said to him was, 'This is a farce.'" Now, I knew she was lying, and her child was present at the time of the incident, indeed, supposedly standing beside her. So I got him in, and he was a very nice boy. And I said to him, "What's a farce?" And he said, "I don't know what a farce is." I said, "What's an arse?" And he said, "Well, that's something rude you call people." And then I said, "Did your mother call Mr. So an arse?" And he said, "Yeah." And it was just, but it's lovely. It was lovely. You know, I would never have dreamt of saying a thing like that to a school teacher.
Yeah.
You know, good.
Very funny, very funny. So if you think about our own school days, Cameron.
Our own school days.
Yeah, so there was one story that I do tell friends quite regularly, actually. It was an April Fool's thing that we had planned on our English teacher, the much loved Mr. Giannone. I don't mind using his name because he was brilliant and much loved. Anyway, we're on the second floor of this rather imposing building, fully lined on one wall by four double-cased windows. And we had opened one case, and Douglas had taken a pair of black Doc Martens shoes, held them in his hand, and stretched both arms and his hands out the window to suggest, perhaps, that a child who'd been wearing these shoes had fallen from a great height. And of course, there was a child that looked as if he had fallen from a great height because Rick had run downstairs and angled himself in the rose bed below where Douglas was holding the black shoes. Anyway, Giannone comes into the room and we're all not screaming, but, you know, we're frantic. And he comes running over to the window. He looks out. He sees Rick, you know, spread-eagled in the rose garden below. Douglas holding the black shoes, ashen-faced and shaking. And Giannone said, "Oh, my God." And he runs out the room, runs down, and we shout down, "Right, Rick, up now." And he gets up out the rose bed, runs into the front door, back into the classroom. We all sit down on our desks. Giannone comes back in, hair all over the place, looking perturbed, and saw Rick sitting in the front row, and we said, "Mr. Johnny, April Fool."
Well, I mean, I think the prank, particularly the April Fool prank, I don't know if young people still do April Fool pranks in that kind of way, really. There was a prank once which went slightly wrong in my experience where some of the sixth year pupils at a very highly respected Edinburgh school climbed into the roof area the intention was, I think, that they would go to the next classroom and make funny noises, I think was their actual intention. But in fact, they got up and into the roof space, went to the next classroom, and then they all fell through into it, interrupting...
During a class?
During a class, interrupting Mr. So-and-so's teaching of the causes of the First World War by just collapsing into the classroom. And there was another occasion when I was a student teacher when the sixth year pupils removed every single thing from the classroom of my boss, the head of English, on April Fool's Day. They removed every single item, including, quite remarkably, the blackboard, because they discovered that the blackboard was bolted to the wall and it was possible to undo the blackboard. And of course, my head department came in, and I was in early, as I always was, always a very hard worker, always very early into school. He came and sought out me, being the only person there, and said, "Is there something happening?" And he said, "I'm kind of having this kind of dream thing that's going on in my head. There's nothing in my classroom." And I said, "What do you mean there's nothing in your classroom?" I went, "There was nothing there." I said, "Must have been must have been cleared. Is it being painted or something? Well, he said, oh, I don't know when I'm supposed to teach. He said, transpired that all the furniture had just been moved by the 60th. Not all the furniture, everything, every single thing had been moved. I suspect they tried to get the radiator off the wall and then realised that that wouldn't work. But anyway, his room was entirely abandoned. And I myself played a rather hurtful April Fool on my first year class once. An April Fool, which in these days would probably lead to me being sacked because I caused them so much stress. It was the last day of the Easter holidays, and I said to my form class, take out your homework diaries because I need to tell you about your exams. Now, the first year didn't get any exams, and they said, exams? And I said, well, yeah, your exams are on the other side of the Easter holidays. And they said, we didn't know we were getting exams. I said, well, now, just take out your homework diaries and I'll write down the exam schedule. And I said, now your English exam, which is the most important exam, obviously, is on the 29th of April, let's say. And they said, but we're still on holiday on the 29th of April. And I said, well, you're not on holiday anymore on the 29th of April. And one of them said, I'll still be in Turkey on the 29th of April. And I said, well, you need to phone your dad and you need to get your dad. I mean, I was just pretending to get increasingly irritated by their childish babble. Phone your dad and tell your dad that he needs to get a ticket, you can maybe come back by yourself, and that's your English exam. And then I said, and then on Monday, there's your Spanish exam. And they said, but we don't do Spanish. And I said, well, you need to learn some during the Easter holidays. And I mean, eventually, there was one of the boys, and I'll just say his name because he a boy called Andrew Diamond, who was as sharp as a razor. And it was originally Glaswegian, I think. And he was quite small at this time. He's now a rather senior lawyer in the city. But he just realised. Yeah. He just realised. And he shut his homework diary and said, it's a joke. It's April Fool's Day. And he threw his homework diary at me, as did they all. It was just glorious. Yeah. I mean, some of them, I think I'd have stopped, when I was getting on to the physics paper 2 or something like that, because
But you know what that highlights? That actually highlights the great thing about teaching, when you have a relationship with a class that you get on well with, and you can have that kind of banter and joke. That's fantastic.
Yeah, see, Rod's never been stabbed. That's
No. I mean, I have done a John Cleese before.
Really lost your temper?
Absolutely.
Well, actually lost your temper?
Yes.
Was that funny though, Rod? This is my funny thing.
Well,
did they laugh at you?
It was funny to everyone else.
It was because you were so angry.
I was so angry, and usually you'll know yourself as a teacher. You can fake a little bit of anger and outrage, and how could you do such a thing? And how could you... Anyway, it was at the time when the school was relatively small. It had become an all-through school, and new kids were vitally important. And I was showing this couple and their daughter, 15-year-old daughter, around the school in order, hopefully, to get them to sign up and to join us. And I was doing my usual tour, and we walked in the main corridor, and then you would turn left, go through a door, and it was this kind of open area. And in the open area, there was, photographs of yesteryear and, former pupils and blah, 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 blah. And there was a couch. And I walked in to find a boy and a girl lying on the couch, smooching.
Smooching, that's a right old-fashioned word, isn't it? Yeah. You just imagine Rod back in the 20s in his wee Dickie Bow suit with his first love, smooching.
Listen, I didn't take the piss out of you with your stories. Don't you stop.
Oh, he's getting slightly heated here. In a minute or two, you might actually do a John Cleese.
Yeah. Well, they were smooching. They were snogging. They were full on. And what really frustrated me was the boy, having seen his headmaster walk into the room and two parents and a young girl behind him, looked at me with pride.
Yeah, well.
As if I would be, shaking his hand. Well done, son. Great job. You pulled. This is a boy that had probably very little success with girls in the past. He was clearly very pleased.
Was he ugly, Rod? Was he an ugly boy?
No, he wasn't. No, he was not.
Why wouldn't he be successful with girls, Rod? Do you just feel...
because of the amount of glee.
He's
on his
actually
face.
getting angry now. I
No,
can
the
tell
amount
you.
of glee in his
The amount of
face.
glee.
He was so pleased. Anyway, as I ushered the parents away from the scene of debauchery towards the science block, I turned round and gave them the cut your throat sign and pointed the two of them. Ooh. You know, you two, you've had it. You have had it. And the kind of gleeful look in his face, that proud moment, dissipated.
But you didn't actually cut their throats later, because it's just important, because you and I have had a long experience of headmastering.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Well, there are many,
things were different back then.
very different. I could certainly have been dismissed on at least 5 occasions for various actions and responses to children. But anyway, we won't go into that. Anyway, I finished the tour, and within
With legal representation.
within 3 or 4 minutes, I recognised the fact that this couple were absolutely not going to sign up their child to this school of utter debauchery. Anyway, I called the two of them into my office, and I absolutely went berserk. You know that scene in Faulty Towers? I don't know if you can remember it, but he actually leaps up and down like a frog
Yes.
with his head in his hands.
Yes.
That's what I was doing, and I wasn't doing it to mimic, Basil Fawlty. I was doing it because I felt it, and spit was coming from my mouth as I shouted this. What on earth do you think you were? And they just looked at me, aghast.
And they said, but this is completely natural, Mr. Grand.
Yeah, what do you think you're doing? Anyway, that story finished. I absolutely, completely and utterly lost it. And of course, the mirth and the merriment amongst the staff was huge because they knew it had happened. And you could hear every word because the staff room was next door to my office. So they're all falling about the place. But I didn't think it was at all funny. It was absolutely a terrible abuse of being a pupil at my school. My school, yeah.
My friend Melanie, who is very, very posh and works in very posh schools and is a magnificent person, is telling a story here about being in an inspection, having the inspectors coming to watch her teaching religious studies in her case. And just at the end of the lesson, which had gone extremely well, the inspector paused outside the open door of her classroom, and one of the pupils said to her, "That was a great lesson, miss, you really smashed that." And they all began to applaud, at which point a bookcase fell down, covering them in books, and the inspector came back into the scene of absolute chaos. And I had a not dissimilar experience during an inspection when I was an English teacher, in fact, when I was head of English. And I have to say, the English inspector and I didn't get on very well. I felt she was rather a grim lady. And unfortunately,
A grim inspector?
I've tried to make my life out of being charming.
Right,
Rod. I mean,
okay.
particularly charming to women,
Right.
actually, for
why I wouldn't
no
have noticed.
particular reason that I can think of. Yes, good. So charming Cameron just failed to pierce the carapace of this very, very, very grim woman. And there were two funny things that happened. One was that during the inspection, I really got bad flu. But obviously, inspections in those days went on for weeks. And obviously, the one thing you could not do at inspection was not go to work. That was just impossible. So I was really, really unwell, And I had a final meeting with her when I was in a state of fever. I was soaked in sweat and I was also very cold. So I was clinging to a radiator, okay?
Yeah.
And she said to me, "Now, Mr. Wyllie, what arrangements are in place in this school for the assessment of pupils in listening at foundation level?" And I said, "Well, we don't have any foundation level pupils," I muttered from somewhere near the. And she said, "I'm sorry, could you just answer the question? What arrangements are in place in this school for the assessment of listening for foundation pupils?" And her friend, or not her friend, he was terrified of her, the young guy who was the assistant English inspector, was looking at me as if I had died, which I was quite close to doing. And he said, "You could just say none." And she shot him a look. and he turned into a pillar of stone. It was extraordinary. Anyway, this later, or earlier in the inspection, in fact, she had come to watch me teach, and she came to watch me teach my favourite ever class. And I know there'll be many, many of you out there who will be thinking you were in that class. But my favourite class knows who they are, don't they? I'm seeing one of them tomorrow. He's now the British consul in San Francisco. And anyway, that class, you know who you are. Two of you got married. Anyway, they were just an absolute joy. They were an unremitting joy. And I've been teaching them for years. So this was the third year I was teaching them. And they were very sparky, always answered questions. So I was teaching them a poem by Robert Frost, the poet I love most, a poem called After Apple Picking, in which he posits the relationship between life and death by wit of a clever mechanism of picking apples off a tree high up, being close to heaven, you see? Mm-hmm. Anyway, they hadn't seen this poem before, but they'd done several Frost poems, and they were all over Robert Frost. They loved Robert Frost. So I knew she was coming, so I had a wee tape recorder of Robert reading his poem, and then I got them to read it. And then, as I always did, I said, "What's this about?" Now, she had swept into the room, wearing a cape and a large hat. This is not a joke.
Very Cruella de Vil.
She was very Cruella de Vil. I mean, it was just like Cruella de Vil. And they were appalled by her and terrified. Yep. And she sat down next to this boy called Alex, who was, I think it's fair to say, quite strange. Okay, I think it's fair to say he was quite strange, though I knew he was very clever. But the other people in the class were very chirpy. A lot of them were big talkers, unlike myself. And they just didn't respond. I said, "Come on, just tell me." And then I said, "Don't worry about Mrs. de Vil being here. Yep. Just tell me the answer to the question." I said, "This is me talking to you now. Pretend she's not here." But they were like frozen. Yeah. They were like paralyzed. Yeah. I tried to get the good girls, one of whom went on to get an exhibition in English at Oxford, to talk to me. But they wouldn't. They were frightened. Yeah. Silence descended, and she had this look of complete satisfaction on her face as she made a note. And then Alex, who was sitting beside her, said, "It's about death!" And she sprang up out of her chair and then sat down again, somewhat dishevelled. And it was a very, very pleasing moment because the whole class laughed uproariously at her. Anyway, she didn't like me. And I think sometimes inspectors don't like teachers, to tell you the truth. They just take against them.
Yeah. There's that sense of authority, I think, but isn't it terrible that a person can have that effect on kids who are normally sparky and interested and willing to talk and being open, and it actually shows you the power of the relationship in a classroom between teacher and student.
I never ever liked having another adult in my classroom. No. Even a student teacher, really, I didn't really like it because it always had some.
It changes the dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely, because they want. I mean, generally speaking, they want to do well for you. So when I was a probationary student, my first ever observed lesson by somebody from Murray House was my great old pal, the late Robbie Robertson, who was a wonderful, wonderful teacher of English teachers. Anyway, Robbie came to watch me teach in a class, and that class was the class of my dear friend and former colleague, now 92, squadron leader, retired J.W. Richardson. Now, Jock was not a man who stood for any nonsense. But after some misgivings, I think he had decided that he quite liked this student. So on the day before my lesson was due, he asked me to leave. And obviously I stood outside so I could hear what he was saying. And he said, "Right now, Mr. Wyllie has got his lesson tomorrow. The guy's coming in to watch him teach. Some of you will have been in that situation before where a teacher is being watched teaching. Just want to say, if I hear of any nonsense during this lesson, there will be real trouble. If he asks a question, you answer it. Do you understand? Don't just sit in silence because there's a stranger in the room. It'll be fine. Just do it." So it was a revision lesson on Tom Sawyer. So I turned up the next day with Robbie. Now, Robbie was he was a very jovial man. He was a bit of a sort of ex-hippie, I always thought. Very easy-going man. He sat at the back of the classroom. And he said, and he didn't say anything. I started teaching, and I said, "Right, so we're going to talk about the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Who wrote the Adventures of Tom Sawyer?" And they all put their hand up, as you would expect. And I said, "Mark Twain." "That's right. So I say, that's not his real name." I said, what do we call it when a writer uses a false name? And they all put their hand up. And I picked a clever one, and he said, it's a pseudonym. And I said, that's right. And I said, where did the name Mark Twain come from? And they all put their hands up. And I said, yes, you, Johnny. And Johnny said, I don't know. And I said, look, I know Mr. Richardson said you should all put your hands up when asked a question, but like, can we make a kind of rule that you only put your hand up if you think you know the answer? It's very, very, very funny.
Brilliant. And of course, there's a story that just sprung to my mind, actually, as a head teacher, where you hear what has happened in a class and you think that was utter genius on behalf of the kid. So we had this substitute history teacher who came in. I didn't have any choice, and I recognised within 5 minutes she was not a good fit. Stern, lack of humour. Had the misfortune of wearing nappies, and they were very obvious.
Wearing nappies?
Yeah. You could tell there was the old tennis pants lady nappy going on, and of course.
Do you know, I don't believe I've ever encountered that or been aware of it. I'm sure I have, Robert, but it's interesting that you're conscious of that.
Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned it. But anyway, she was immediately unlikable, and the kids didn't like her. And we had one really sparky class full of really bright kids, but not just bright kids, funny kids. Great sense of humour, very forward of school, didn't like this teacher. And one boy, a black boy, decided that he was going to make out that he was uneducated and had just arrived in the country. Sorry, don't worry. You're looking there.
Imagine my alarm, regional listeners.
You're looking nervous. Anyway, this was winter time, and it started to snow. And he stood up, and the rest of the class were all in it. He was they were hysterical, but not showing it. He looked out the window and it was snowing, and he, stop! What is this white stuff falling from the sky? And she then goes, well, this is snow. This is snow. It's frozen water. It's because it's cold outside, so instead of rain, it's snow. It's wonderful. I never see this before. I never see this. And on another occasion, he said, Miss, may I go to watering hole for water? And she looked at him, and she never got it. She didn't get it. She just accepted that this was for real. And the same teacher then went to the head of the faculty, complaining about this class and, this boy's behaviour about standing up and shouting out. She said, well, what are you going to do about it? And I said, well, I'll speak to the class, and we'll make sure that they're listening and doing what they're meant to be doing. And she says, and they're laughing at my flatulence. What are you going to do about that? He said, what do you like me to do about it?
Is that really true?
That is absolutely the God's honest
The teacher
truth.
was complaining to the head that they were laughing at our flatulence.
Yes, and what is he going to do about it?
I thought you were going to tell me that she the word flatulence was wrong. She meant something else.
No.
Well, in a similar mode, just to wind up, I would think, because we must be charging on now, and people's patience out there will be getting a little bit thin, I think. I'm just going to tell a story, which is actually a story, I apologise to those of you, the many of you who've read it. It's actually a story from my book. Just in case you haven't read it, my book's called Is There a Pigeon in the Room? My Life in Schools. But this was one of my favourite little stories, and it's not dissimilar because it's about a teacher taking over my class. So in 1986, a long time ago, I was sent on a scholarship to, where was I sent on a scholarship to? To the United States for 3 weeks. And it was during term time, which caused a bit of an upset, I suppose, in the English department. But anyway, they brought in a nice old lady, and I gave her a very careful briefing before I left. Now, at this point, I had 2 classes that were particularly noteworthy, or in fact, I think she was only covering these 2 classes. One of them was a 4th-year class, which consisted of loud, large boys who I really liked, but it had taken me quite a while to calm them down. And the other one was my 3rd-year class, which was full of really smart kids, some of whom were a bit unpleasant at times. So I said to her, look, with the fourth year class, just come down on them really, really as hard as you can right at the beginning and they'll love you. And I said, with the third year class, just watch out because just never completely trust them. So I went away to the States for 3 glorious weeks and then I came back and I was debriefed by her and she said, well, I didn't agree with you about these classes at all. She said the fourth year class were terrible. She said I had to keep getting, the head of department in to shut them up, and I've given them all sorts of punishments, and I'll expect you to be giving them a stern word because they really let you down. And I said, oh right. And she said, but the third year class, what a lovely class, all gentlemen. And I knew there was a problem. And I said, all gentlemen. She said, yes, they were so funny and so pleasing to teach. And I said to her, which ones did you particularly like? And she said, well, I particularly liked Adolf. Now, it will not surprise you that in the parental body which was giving birth to the children there wasn't an enormous desire to call your child Adolf in 1986 or 12 years before, 14 years before that. And I said, oh, Adolf, right. I said, which one was Adolf? And she described this very, very naughty, but very funny red-haired boy. And I said, right, Adolf, who does he sit next to? And she said, oh, he sits next to Donald Dick. And there was obviously nobody in the class called Donald Dick either. I mean, you couldn't have survived in a boys' school if you were called Mr. Dick. And then it was the case that every single child in the class had made up a name for themselves, and most of which were absurd, some of which were foreign names. I mean, they were calling themselves things like Wang Po, but they were not Chinese. Yeah. And it was very difficult to deal with her on this because she clearly thought that they had really loved her when in fact they had just constantly been taking the mickey out of her. Yeah. Anyhow, the end here, Rod.
Well, that was a good note to finish on. I love stories where, kids get one over on their teacher, but in a clever way, in a kind of an intelligent way.
Rather than by stabbing them.
Yeah, rather than by stabbing them, or kicking, spitting.
Yes,
throwing books at them.
Calling them up, whatever.
Well, let's have an intelligent ability at undermining.
If a child's going to undermine us, let it be a clever child.
Exactly.
I completely agree with that.
Well, on that note, that's it for this episode of Two Heads Are Better Than One. And we hope you've enjoyed our journey through the world of schools and leadership, and especially today's discussion on funny things that can happen in school. And if you've got thoughts, questions, or stories of your own, we'd love to hear them. And as we've said before, on many occasions, you can reach us on rodandcameron@gmail.com.
And we should say that our next episode, we're going to have a guest. So it's going to be serious. We're going to have a serious guest, and the serious guest is going to be talking about special education needs or additional support needs, or one of the many, many acronyms. And I know she's got some very interesting views on this, which she has emailed me. In an email, which I think it's fair to say, she said, of course, I can't possibly say any of these things, but we're going to make her say them. So if you have views about additional support needs or special educational needs, or if you'd like to tell us a funny story, please contact us on rodandcameron@gmail.com. Don't be shy.
Yeah, and that doesn't even need to be written. You can leave us a voice note. And on that, make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. And if you've enjoyed today's chat, leaving a quick review really helps more listeners find us.
And telling your friends.
Absolutely.
Tell your friends. You've got many friends. I know you have. Yeah. Just tell your many friends about this podcast.
Okay. Good idea, Cameron. Good idea. And remember, in education and in life, two heads really are better than one. Thanks for listening.
And cheery bye.
Class dismissed.